The finality of it was the cold. It was not the biting cold of a winter wind, but the deep internal chill of a door closing forever. Ilara stood on the boardwalk outside the lawyer's office in the town of Providence, a thin wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Inside, her husband's brother, Marcus, had spoken in a low, flat voice that offered no room for argument. Thomas was gone, buried 2 days now, and with him any claim she had to the life they had built. Marcus had pushed a small leather pouch into her hand. The coins inside were few, their weight a mockery of the years she had poured into the farm. He also gave her a folded piece of paper, the deed to a parcel of land Thomas had won in a card game long ago. It was a joke then, a worthless scrap of mountain. It was her inheritance now. "The farm requires a man's hand," Marcus had said, his eyes avoiding hers. "This is more than fair. You are no longer our concern." She was an outsider before she had married Thomas, and now she was an outsider again. The community of Providence, which had offered clipped sympathies at the graveside, now looked through her. They were practical people, and a widow with no land and no family was a problem they did not wish to solve. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, the paltry coins in her purse, the deed to a place called The Scar, and Thomas's old dog, Rook, who sat faithfully at her feet, his grizzled head resting on her worn boots. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, stepped out onto his porch, wiping his hands on his apron. He saw her standing there, a solitary figure against the afternoon sun. He was a man who dealt in facts and figures, and he saw a woman who was a poor calculation. "A sad business, Ilara," he said, his tone dripping with a practiced public pity. "Marcus is a hard man, but the law is the law." He gestured vaguely towards the mountains. "That land, the Scar, it's nothing, a sheer rock face, useless. You'd do best to sell the deed for a few dollars, if anyone would even buy it." He offered his sensible advice like spoonfuls of bitter medicine. She could work for the saloon, washing linens. She could take in mending. She could use the coin for a ticket back east, to whatever forgotten family she might have there. He saw her as a loose thread to be neatly tied off, a problem to be filed away. The town was a machine, and she was a broken part. Ilara listened, her face as still as carved stone. The wind tugged at a loose strand of her hair, whipping it across her cheek. She looked at Mr. Gable, at the solid wood of his mercantile, at the faces of the townspeople passing by, their gazes sliding away from hers. They had already buried her alongside her husband. They were just waiting for her to lie down. But as she stood there, the cold of injustice began to burn. A quiet, stubborn fire ignited deep within her. She would not be erased. She would not become a ghost in their town, subsisting on their pity. She turned without a word and walked into the mercantile. Rook padded silently behind her. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that felt like a declaration. Mr. Gable followed her in, a flicker of confusion on his face. He expected tears, pleas, the crumpled posture of defeat. Instead, he saw a woman moving with a purpose that unnerved him. She did not look at the fabrics or the canned goods. She walked to the back, where the tools were kept. Her hands, accustomed to kneading dough and tending a garden, ran over the smooth, heavy hickory of an axe handle. She hefted it, feeling its balance. She used nearly all her coins, a good felling axe, the stoutest shovel head he had in stock, a small sack of salt, and another of iron nails, a ball of twine, a thick wool blanket. Each purchase was a quiet renunciation of his advice. She was not buying a ticket out, she was buying the means to dig in. Mr. Gable tallied the cost, his lips pursed. "This is a fool's errand, girl," he said, his voice low. "There is nothing for you out there but wind and rock." Ilara met his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear, without a tremor of fear or doubt. "This land is mine," she said. It was the simplest of truths, and the only one she had left. She gathered her supplies, tied the blanket roll to her back, and walked out of the store. The bell chimed her departure. She did not look back. With Rook at her side, she turned her face toward the jagged peaks on the horizon and began to walk. The journey was a punishment. The path that led from Providence dwindled from a wagon-rutted track into a faint animal trail, then disappeared altogether. The landscape grew teeth. Sharp rocks tore at the hem of her skirt and the soles of her boots. The weight of the axe and shovel dug into her shoulders, a constant, biting reminder of the task ahead. For 2 days she and Rook moved through a world that grew increasingly hostile and desolate. She saw no one. The world of men, of warm hearths and solid roofs, had fallen away behind her. There was only the scream of the wind through skeletal pines and the vast, indifferent sky. Rook stayed close, a warm, breathing presence in the crushing loneliness. He did not complain, did not falter, his loyalty a silent reproach to the world she had left behind. On the evening of the second day she found it, the scar. It was worse than Mr. Gable had described. It was not a piece of land, it was a wound in the earth. A towering cliff of gray, unforgiving granite rose hundreds of feet into the air, a sheer vertical wall where nothing grew. At its base was a shallow overhang, a slight scoop in the rock, littered with fallen scree and debris. This was her inheritance. This was her home. For a long moment she could not move. The axe slipped from her numb fingers and clattered against the stones. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. The town was right. Marcus was right. Gable was right. This was a place of death, a geological tombstone. Tears she had refused to shed in Providence now burned hot in her eyes. The wind clawed at her, and for the first time she felt a tremor of true fear. She had traded the slow death of pity for the quick death of foolish pride. She sank to her knees, the sharp stones biting into her flesh, and Rook whined, nudging his wet nose into her hand. Night fell like a dropped stone, and the temperature plummeted. The wind howled with a new ferocity, a physical predator hunting for warmth. Shivering, Ilara dragged herself and her supplies into the shallow alcove, pressing her back against the immense stone face. It was a pathetic shelter, open to the world on 3 sides, but it was all she had. She huddled with Rook, sharing the thin blanket, preparing for a night of bitter cold and sleepless regret. But as the hours passed, she noticed something strange. The wind, which raged just a few feet away, did not seem to reach her. Its roar was muffled, its icy talons kept at bay by the slight curve of the rock. And there was something else. The stone at her back. It was not warm, but it was not the biting, soul-leeching cold of the other rocks she touched. It felt neutral, solid, as if it held a memory of the afternoon sun deep within its core. She pressed her palm flat against it. The granite was vast, ancient, and it felt impossibly solid, a bulwark against the chaos of the night. While the air around her grew frigid, the rock seemed to exhale a deep, resonant stillness. It was a thermal mass. It absorbed the heat of the day and released it slowly, grudgingly, through the cold of the night. Then she heard it, a sound almost lost beneath the wind, a steady, rhythmic plink, plink, plink. It was the sound of water. She strained her eyes in the darkness and saw it, a tiny, glistening bead forming on a fissure deep in the back of the alcove, swelling and then dropping onto a flat stone below, a constant, reliable drip of clean water seeping from the very heart of the mountain. It was not a gushing spring, but it was life. It was a secret. The worthless place, the geological joke, had a hidden heart. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, beaten back by a new feeling, a grim, savage resolve. The town had seen a useless cliff face. She was beginning to see the back wall of a house. The wind howled its fury, but huddled in the lee of the great stone, Ilara felt the first stirrings of a plan. The mountain would not be her tomb, it would be her fortress. The work began at dawn. It was a battle waged with muscle and will against the unyielding reality of stone and wood. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic labor, were the first casualties. Within hours of swinging the axe, blisters rose on her palms. By noon they had broken, leaving raw, weeping flesh. The pain was a constant fire, but she wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept working. She had to. To stop was to die. She felled the slender pines that grew in a small copse a quarter-mile down the slope. Each tree was a monumental struggle. The crack of the trunk giving way was a victory, but it was followed by the back-breaking labor of limbing the branches and then dragging the log, inch by agonizing inch, up the slope to her building site. Rook, sensing the desperate importance of the task, would often brace himself and pull alongside her, his paws scrabbling for purchase, his low growls a sound of pure effort. She used the cliff face as the unbreachable back wall of her home. Her shelter would be a three-sided structure leaning against the mountain's strength. For the side walls, she gathered stones from the scree field below. Some were small enough to carry, but the larger ones, the vital foundation stones, had to be rolled and levered into place with a green log, a process that demanded every ounce of her strength and ingenuity. Her muscles screamed, her back ached with a pain so deep it became a kind of numbness. But wall rose, stone by stubborn stone. She found a deposit of rich clay near the seep, and she mixed it with dry grasses and water to create a crude but effective mortar. She packed it into every crevice between the stones, her raw hands smearing the thick, earthy paste, sealing her home against the wind. Each sealed gap was a triumph. A tiny pocket of stillness rested from the howling wilderness. The roof was the greatest challenge. She laid the pine log she had felled from the top of one stone wall to the other, creating a sturdy frame. Then she wove a thick mat of smaller branches and pine boughs over them. The final layer was sod, cut from the valley floor and hauled up in her skirt. She laid it carefully, grass side up, creating a living roof that would provide insulation and absorb the rain. The first time a drizzle began and she stood inside, dry and protected, a fierce, quiet pride swelled in her chest. With the basic shelter built, she turned to the systems that would keep her alive. Heat was paramount. She built a fireplace and hearth of flat stones against one of the side walls. The chimney, however, presented a problem. A conventional chimney would be battered by the winds that swept along the cliff face. Then she remembered the fissures in the rock. Exploring the back of her shelter, she found a narrow crack, no wider than her hand, that snaked upwards into the darkness. Holding a lit pine torch near it, she saw the flame flicker and pull inwards. It had a natural draw. Carefully, painstakingly, she channeled the top of her fireplace towards that fissure, sealing the connection with a thick collar of clay and rock. The first time she lit a fire, she held her breath. The smoke hesitated for a moment. Then, as if summoned by the mountain itself, it was drawn up into the crack and vanished. Outside, no plume of smoke was visible. It vented hundreds of feet above, a faint haze lost against the sky. Her home had a secret lung. The great stone wall behind the fire began to drink in the heat, becoming a massive, silent radiator. Next was water. The slow drip from the fissure was life, but she needed to store it. Using her shovel and the sharp edge of a stone, she spent days chipping and scraping a basin into the rock floor directly beneath the drip. It was brutal, mind-numbing work. When the depression was deep enough, she lined it with a thick, smooth layer of the same clay she'd used for mortar, packing it down until it was watertight. She created a cistern. The steady plink, plink. Plink was no longer a sound of desperation, but the sound of her home's ever-beating heart. She knew she could not survive on snared rabbits alone. She needed a more stable source of food. This required a sacrifice. Tucked away in a small cloth pouch was the last thing of value she owned, Thomas's silver pocket watch. Leaving Rook to guard their home, she made a 3-day journey, not back towards Providence, but south to the edge of the settled farmlands where she was not known. She traded the watch, a relic of her old life, for 3 laying hens and a pregnant nanny goat. The journey back with the animals was a fresh ordeal. She carried the chickens in a makeshift crate and led the goat on a rope, coaxing the stubborn animal over every rock and ravine. People would have laughed, a woman leading a tiny menagerie to a home made of rock and mud. Let them laugh. She was building a world. Inside her shelter, she built a small, warm pen for the animals against the far end of the great stone wall. The radiated heat from the cliff would help keep them alive through the winter. The chickens, after a few days of nervous clucking, began to lay eggs. The goat provided a small but steady supply of rich milk. These were not just animals, they were partners in survival. Her final system was the most audacious. In the dim, reflected light of the alcove, nothing should grow. But the temperature was stable, protected from the worst of the frost. For weeks she made the arduous trip down to the valley floor, filling her apron with the dark, rich soil she found there. She hauled it, load by painful load, up to her home and built 2 shallow, rock-lined garden beds. In them she planted the few hardy seeds she had brought with her, kale, turnips, and onions. In the strange, permanent twilight of the alcove, warmed by the great stone, the seeds sprouted. The sight of those first tiny green shoots pushing through the dark soil was a miracle, a defiant splash of life against the gray stone. Rook was her shadow, her guard, her only confidant. He seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He never strayed far. His ears were a constant barometer of the wilderness, twitching at the snap of a twig or the distant cry of a hawk. At night, he slept curled at the foot of her straw-filled mattress, a warm, living anchor in the vast, silent dark. His presence was the one thing that kept the crushing weight of solitude from breaking her. He was the last gift from her old life, and the first citizen of her new one. The wilderness kept its own counsel, but the world of men was never far away. One afternoon, a hunter from Providence named Brant, tracking a deer far from his usual grounds, stumbled upon her settlement. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle held loosely in his hand, his mouth agape. He saw the stone walls, the sod roof, the impossible wisp of heat shimmering from the invisible chimney. He saw a woman, her face smudged with dirt and her dress frayed, calmly feeding a goat. Brant did not stay long. He mumbled a greeting, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then retreated back the way he had come. Ilara knew what would follow. He was a man who loved a good story, and he had just found the best one of his life. Within a week, the story had woven its way through the fabric of Providence. It was told over barrels in Gable's Mercantile, whispered between pews after Sunday service. The woman who had marched into the wilderness with an axe was not dead. She was alive, living in a hole in the rocks like a wild animal. The details grew with each telling. She was mad with grief. She ate roots and bark. She talked to the stones. The town, in its collective wisdom, gave her a name. They called her the Cave Woman. It was a term of pity and derision, a way to package her strangeness into a neat, dismissible box. Mr. Gable was particularly fond of the story. He used it as a cautionary tale for anyone with ideas above their station. "See what happens when you don't listen to reason," he would say, leaning on his counter. "Pride will lead you to a cold bed in the rocks." His words painted her as a fool, confirming his own sound judgment and the town's sensible ways. Ilara knew nothing of the name, but she felt the scorn. No one else came near her land, but she could feel their judgment radiating from the distant town, a cold pressure on the horizon. She was an outcast, a story told to frighten children and amuse gossips. Her isolation was now complete. Before the great test of winter, there were smaller trials. One night, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the goat, circled her home. Their howls echoed off the cliff face, a terrifying chorus of hunger. Rook stood before the heavy wooden door, the fur on his back ridged, his barks a deep, ferocious answer to their calls. Ilara stood behind him, the heavy axe in her hands, her heart pounding. But the walls held. The door, barred with a thick log, did not yield. The wolves, unable to find purchase on the sheer rock or breach the solid walls, eventually faded back into the forest. The ordeal left her shaken, but with a deeper trust in what she had built. Her home was not just a shelter, it was a fortress. As autumn bled into winter, the world began to shut down. The days grew short and sharp, the nights brutally long. A deep, profound quiet settled over the mountains. This was the time she had been preparing for, the long siege. Her life shrank to a series of simple, vital rhythms. Each morning began in darkness. She would stir the embers in the fireplace, adding new logs from the massive stockpile she had spent months accumulating. The fire was the center of her universe, a living thing that had to be fed and tended. With the fire secure, she would milk the goat, her cold fingers working deftly. She would feed the chickens, their soft clucking a comforting sound in the stillness. She would check the water in the cistern, the steady drip, drip, drip a constant reassurance. Her world was the warm, fire-lit space carved out of the rock. It smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and the clean scent of pine. The great stone wall at her back was a constant, warm presence. Even when the fire burned low at night, the rock gave back the heat it had absorbed, keeping the killing frost at bay. Outside, the temperature might drop to unimaginable depths, but inside her small kingdom, life persisted. She was utterly alone, but she was not helpless. She was the sovereign of this world she had made. She mended her clothes by firelight. She cooked her simple meals. She watched her small garden of kale and turnips produce their miraculous green leaves in the dead of winter. The solitude was a physical presence, a vast, silent ocean, but she had built an island. Day by day, routine by routine, she held her ground, waiting for the full fury of the winter to arrive. It came in the third week of January. The old-timers in Providence would later call it the Great White Hurricane of '83. It was not a storm. It was a war declared by the sky. It did not begin with a gentle snowfall, but with a sudden, violent assault of wind that screamed like a banshee, carrying ice that scoured the landscape like sand. The world outside Ilara's home vanished. It was erased, replaced by a churning, roaring vortex of white. The sun disappeared, the sky disappeared. There was only the storm, a physical entity that hammered at the world. It was a force of pure chaos, a rage that sought to tear everything down, to freeze everything solid, to bury everything under a shroud of impenetrable white. But inside the shelter, at the scar, there was an almost impossible calm. The howling of the wind was a distant, muffled roar, the sound of a faraway battle. The great stone of the cliff absorbed the storm's fury, turning its violent vibrations into a low, resonant hum. Her sod roof, now buried under a deep drift of snow, became an even better insulator. The fire in her hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn cleanly up the hidden fissure, untroubled by the tempest outside. The contrast was staggering. Outside was a world of violent, motion-filled death. Inside was a pocket of warm, ordered life. Her animals were calm, huddled in their pen against the radiating warmth of the stone. Her small winter garden was untouched. The cistern continued its steady, life-giving drip. She was not fighting the storm. She was living outside of its reach. She had built a home so perfectly attuned to its environment that the apocalypse raging outside was merely a spectacle. For 3 days, as the blizzard tried to unmake the world, she moved through her routines, a queen in a castle of stone and silence. In Providence, the world was breaking. The town was built of wood and pride, and both were proving fragile. The wind, like a giant's fist, punched through walls and tore shingles from roofs. The snow, heavy and wet, accumulated in terrifying drifts, its weight causing the roof of the main church hall to groan and then collapse with a deafening crack, burying the pews in a mountain of white. Families huddled in their homes, which were fast becoming iceboxes. Chimneys, improperly built or poorly maintained, clogged with ice and snow, filling rooms with choking smoke and forcing people to extinguish their precious fires. Firewood, thought to be plentiful, ran out with shocking speed, as every stove burned day and night against a cold that seemed to have teeth. Livestock, the town's lifeblood, froze to death in their barns, their stiff bodies monuments to a storm no one had prepared for. The confidence of Providence, its bedrock belief in its own sensible, superior way of life, was shattering like thin ice under a hammer. On the third night of the storm, a sound unlike the wind reached Elara's door. It was a frantic, desperate banging, nearly lost in the gale. Rook erupted in a frenzy of barking, not the territorial warning he gave to wolves, but a sound of alarm and confusion. Elara grabbed the axe, her heart leaping into her throat, and moved to the heavy door. She listened and heard it again, a human fist against the wood. She lifted the heavy bar and pulled the door inward. A figure, more snow than man, collapsed into her home, falling to the floor in a heap. It was Brant, the hunter. His face was a mask of ice, his lips blue, his hands raw and frostbitten. He had been checking his trap lines, caught by the storm's sudden violence, and had spent 2 days trying to fight his way back to town. He had been lost, freezing, dying, when he saw a faint, impossible glow that seemed to be coming from the solid rock of the scar. Elara dragged him toward the fire, pulling off his frozen gloves and boots. She wrapped him in blankets and forced hot broth between his chattering teeth. As warmth slowly returned to his body, words began to tumble out, ragged and panicked. The town, he gasped, was dying. The church was gone. The Henderson family was trapped in their collapsed home. And Mr. Gable? His youngest daughter, Sarah, was sick with a lung fever, and their house was as cold as a tomb. They had run out of firewood yesterday. Elara looked at the man who had mocked her, who had been the author of her ridiculous nickname. She looked at her own stockpile of wood, stacked neatly against the wall, a carefully calculated supply meant to last her, and her alone until spring. She looked at her stores of preserved food, her most precious resource. Every instinct of survival screamed at her to bar the door, to keep what was hers, to let the town that had cast her out face the consequences of its own folly. The memory of their scorn was a bitter coal in her gut. But then she looked at Brant's terrified eyes, and she saw the face of Gable's little girl, a child with bright ribbons in her hair, who had once smiled at her in the street. The choice was not about them, it was about her. It was a choice between the person they thought she was, a strange, half-wild creature, concerned only with herself, and the person she had become. She had not built this fortress just to watch the world die. She had built it to hold life. Without a word, she stood up. She pulled on her heaviest coat and wrapped her face in a scarf. She went to her stores and began to pack a small sled she had built for hauling firewood. She loaded it with precious logs, with blankets, with a pot of still hot soup, and a small pouch of dried herbs for a fever tea. She would not let them freeze, not because they deserved her help, but because she was capable of giving it. Her resilience had forged not just a shelter, but a strength of character they could not comprehend. The rescue was an act of madness. She ventured back out into the storm she had so brilliantly defeated, a storm that was still at the peak of its fury. With Brant stumbling behind her and Rook breaking a trail through the waist-deep snow, she pushed the sled into the roaring white chaos. The journey to Providence was a battle for every foot, a nightmare of blinding snow and brutal, soul-crushing wind. It was her knowledge of the terrain and Rook's unerring instinct that guided them through the whiteout, following a path that no one else could have found. When they finally reached the edge of the town, it was a ghost of itself, a collection of half-buried shapes under a sky of churning gray. They made their way to Gable's Mercantile. The windows were opaque with thick frost. Pushing the door open, they were met with a wave of profound cold. The Gable family was huddled together in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The air was frigid, their breath misting in front of their faces. Little Sarah was lying on a sofa, pale and still, her breathing shallow and ragged. Mr. Gable looked up, his face a portrait of exhausted despair. When he saw Elara standing in the doorway, framed by the swirling snow, he simply stared. His mind could not process the image. The cave woman, the fool from the scar, the object of his pity and condescension, was here. She was not begging for help. She was bringing it. He watched, speechless, as she and Brant brought in the firewood, as she knelt by the cold hearth, and, with practiced skill, coaxed a new fire to life. The rescued family members, and the few others who had made it to the relative safety of the Mercantile, watched in stunned silence. They saw a woman they thought was barely surviving, who looked more capable and alive than any of them. They saw the warmth spreading from the new fire. They smelled the rich aroma of the soup. They felt the thick wool of the blankets she handed out. They were seeing the impossible made real. As Elara knelt by his daughter's side, gently wiping her brow with a damp cloth and coaxing a few sips of warm herbal tea past her lips, Mr. Gable finally found his voice. It was a hoarse whisper, filled with a shame so deep it was painful. "How?" he asked, looking around his freezing, failing home. "How are you alive?" He expected an explanation of some lucky trick, a fluke of circumstance. He did not expect the quiet competence with which she moved, the sheer solidity of her presence. As the fire roared to life, pushing back the deadly cold, the truth began to dawn on him, a truth so profound it dismantled his entire view of the world. He looked at her, this woman his town had dismissed and discarded. He saw the calloused hands, the steady eyes, the quiet strength that radiated from her like the heat from the fire, and he understood. He and his town, with their wooden houses and their conventional wisdom, had been the foolish ones. They had built on a foundation of pride. She had built on a foundation of rock. "We called you the cave woman," he said, his voice breaking. We laughed. "My God," he choked out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We were the fools." It was the confession she had every right to receive with triumph. It was the moment for an "I told you so" that would echo for generations. But Elara did not even look at him. Her focus was on the sick child. She simply arranged a blanket more snugly around Sarah's shoulders and replied in a low, practical voice, "The child needs warmth. See to the fire." Her grace was more stunning than any accusation. She did not offer absolution, nor did she demand apology. She offered practical kindness. She showed them how to stuff rags into the cracks around the window frames to stop the drafts. She explained the importance of a small pot of water near the fire to keep the air moist for the girls' lungs. Her response to their shame was not words, but work. In her quiet, profound mercy, she gave them not what they deserved, but what they needed. This was her victory, not that she had been proven right, but that she had retained the humanity they had tried to strip from her. When the great storm finally broke, the people of Providence emerged into a changed world. Their town was battered, their losses grievous. But as the survivors began to take stock, a new story was already taking root, a story told in hushed, awe-filled tones by Brant and the Gables. It was the story of the woman at the scar. In the days that followed, a slow pilgrimage began. People made the difficult journey to her home, not to mock, but to see. They came with offerings, a sack of flour, a side of bacon, but mostly they came to learn. They stood in the alcove and stared, their faces filled with wonder. They saw the elegant simplicity of her systems, the great stone wall that held the heat, the clever chimney that left no trace, the cistern that provided endless water, the sheltered animals, the impossible garden growing in the dead of winter. The derisive nickname, the Cave Woman, was retired forever. Now, when they spoke of her, it was with a reverence usually reserved for founders and prophets. They called her Ilara of the Scar, and the name held the weight of a legend. Mr. Gable, humbled and changed, became her staunchest advocate, directing anyone in need of sound advice, not to his own store of goods, but to the woman on the mountain. The town of Providence did not just rebuild, it was reborn. The lessons of the Scar were etched into its new identity. When new homes were constructed, they were built differently. People began to favor building against hillsides, digging foundations deep into the earth to borrow its thermal stability. Stone, once seen as a mere obstacle, became a prized building material. Her methods, born of desperate necessity, became the new wisdom of the region. Her story spread far beyond the valley. Travelers and traders carried it to other towns, a tale of resilience and ingenuity that grew with each telling. The lone woman who had turned a worthless cliff face into an unbreakable sanctuary became a symbol of the frontier's truest spirit. Her home was no longer a mark of exile. It became a landmark, a destination, a testament to the idea that the most valuable things are often found where no one else thinks to look. Years passed. Ilara remained at the Scar, but she was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of the community, the quiet center around which it revolved. She never sought power or praise, but she earned a deep and abiding respect that was worth more than either. She shared her knowledge freely, teaching others how to read the land, how to work with nature instead of against it, how to build not for pride, but for permanence. The final image of her is one of peace, an old woman, her hair the color of snow, standing outside the home she carved from the rock. She is watching the sunset paint the face of the great cliff in hues of orange and rose. The stone, which had received the sun's energy all day, now begins its slow, steady exhalation of warmth, a silent promise against the coming cold of the night. She built more than a house. She built a life, proving that true worth is not found in what you are given, but in what you create from the pieces you have left. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but in the quiet, enduring warmth of stone.